I've worked the floor of the Venetian for 25 years. 25 years of shuffling chips, reading faces, and keeping my composure when everything in me wanted to snap. I started as a cocktail server when I was 22, worked my way up to floor supervisor, and 4 years ago, I was promoted to shift manager for the high-limit room. It wasn't a glamorous climb. It was early mornings, late nights, missed holidays, and more than a few moments where I had to swallow my pride and smile at someone who didn't deserve one. But I loved it. I loved the rhythm of the casino floor, the low hum of the slot machines bleeding into the clatter of roulette wheels, the way the air smelled like recycled cold and faint cologne. It was my world. I knew every inch of it. I had watched this building evolve, watched managers come and go, watched policies change and change again. I had outlasted recessions, a pandemic, 3 ownership transitions, and more drama than most people see in a lifetime. The Venetian wasn't just my job. It was the closest thing I had to a second home. My name is Danielle Reyes, and I need to tell you about the week that almost ended my career, and what happened when the truth finally caught up to the woman who tried to bury me. It started on a Tuesday. Not a busy Tuesday, not a high-roller Tuesday, just a regular midweek shift where the high-limit room was maybe half full and the energy was calm. I was doing my rounds when I noticed a woman I'll call Sandra Croft walk through the velvet rope. She wasn't a regular. I would have remembered her. I remember every face that comes through that room with any frequency. She was dressed well, expensive blazer, heels that clicked with purpose, and she carried herself the way people do when they want to make sure you know they have money. She sat down at blackjack table 4 and exchanged what looked like $3,000 in cash for chips. I noted it, as I always do, and kept moving. The dealer at table 4 that evening was a man I'd worked alongside for nearly 18 years. His name was Marco Torres, and he was one of the best dealers I had ever seen. Precise, professional, personable, without being intrusive. He had a wife, 2 kids in middle school, and a mortgage in Henderson. He was the kind of employee who made my job easier just by showing up. I trusted him completely. In 18 years, I had never once received a credible complaint about Marco. Not one. He had received more commendations from guests than any other dealer on our shift, and twice he had been nominated internally for Employee of the Quarter. He was, in every measurable way, exactly the kind of person you want standing behind a table in a room where the minimum bet is $500. About 40 minutes into Sandra's session at his table, I noticed her wave me over. I walked over with a smile and asked if everything was all right. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, something between irritation and calculation, and said she'd like to speak with someone about the way her last hand had been handled. I told her I was the shift manager and she could speak with me directly. She said she preferred to speak with someone above me. I told her, still smiling, that I was the senior authority on the floor for this shift, and that I was happy to help resolve any concern. She looked me up and down, then decided to proceed. She told me that on the previous hand, Marco had made an error in her favor, misread the count, and paid her out more than she was owed, and then when she pointed it out to him, he had been rude to her. She said he rolled his eyes, made a comment under his breath, and that she felt disrespected. I thanked her for bringing it to my attention and told her I would review the hand and speak with Marco. What I didn't tell Sandra was that I had been standing less than 15 feet away for the majority of her session. I had been watching table 4 on and off all evening, not because anything seemed wrong, but because it was part of my routine. I rotate my attention across every table in the room on a consistent pattern. I hadn't seen or heard anything that matched her description, but I kept that to myself for the moment. In 25 years, I had learned that the worst thing you can do in the middle of a complaint is tell the guest they're wrong before you've completed your review. You gather your information first. Then you act. I pulled up the overhead footage on the floor tablet and reviewed the hand in question. The camera angle above table 4 was one of our best. High resolution, wide coverage, and a secondary angle from the pit camera that caught the dealer's hands and the chip tray simultaneously. I watched the hand 3 times. Marco had read the count correctly. The payout was accurate. And at no point did Marco roll his eyes, lean away, mutter anything, or display any behavior that could reasonably be described as rude. In fact, after the hand concluded, I could see him smile at Sandra and ask if she'd like to continue or take a short break. She had smiled back. I could see that too. I went back to Sandra and told her, as diplomatically as I could, that I had reviewed the footage and the hand had been paid correctly, and that I hadn't observed any conduct from the dealer that would constitute disrespect. I offered to have her moved to a different table if she'd be more comfortable with a different dealer, and I offered her a complimentary beverage service. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she expected more from a property like this. She picked up her chips, cashed out, and left. I thought that was the end of it. I wrote up a brief incident note, logged the footage timestamp for reference, and finished my shift. I went home, fed my cat, watched half an episode of something I can't even remember now, and went to sleep. I had no idea that Sandra Croft had already started making calls. The next morning I came in for my afternoon shift, and my director, a man named Philip Garrett, asked me to come to his office before I hit the floor. Philip had been my director for about 3 years. He was competent, generally fair, and deeply allergic to conflict. The moment I walked in and saw the expression on his face, I knew something had escalated. He told me that a guest had filed a formal complaint the previous evening, not through the floor, not through guest services, but directly through the corporate guest relations line. The complaint named me by name. It stated that I had been dismissive, that I had failed to address a dealer's misconduct, and that I had made the guest feel unwelcome in a space where she had intended to spend a significant amount of money. The complaint also stated, and this is where my stomach dropped, that I had told the guest the footage had been reviewed and deleted, and that there was therefore no way to verify her account. I stared at Philip. I said, very carefully, that I had not said that. I said I had told her the footage was reviewed, and that it showed no misconduct. I had never mentioned deletion. I had never said anything remotely close to that. Philip nodded slowly and said he believed me, but that the complaint had gone to the regional director's office, and they were taking it seriously. He said there would be an internal review. I asked if I could provide the footage as part of that review. He said yes, absolutely, that was the standard process. I told him the timestamp was already logged in my incident report from last night. He looked slightly relieved at that. I was not relieved at all, because I had spent 25 years in this industry, and I knew exactly how these things could spiral if the wrong people decided to make them spiral. The internal review was assigned to a woman in HR named Claudette Simmons. I had worked with Claudette on 2 previous investigations over the years, both minor, both resolved quickly, and I had always found her to be thorough and fair. She called me in for a preliminary interview 2 days after the complaint was filed. I walked her through everything. I gave her the incident report. I gave her the footage timestamps. I told her exactly what I had said to Sandra, word for word as best as I could reconstruct it, and I told her what I had not said. Claudette took notes and thanked me and said she'd be in touch. What I didn't know at the time was that Sandra had already submitted a second complaint. This one was longer, more detailed, and included new claims. According to the second complaint, I had not only failed to address the dealer's misconduct, but had actively covered for him because he was a personal friend. She claimed that I had a pattern of protecting certain male dealers on my team while holding female dealers and guests to a different standard. She also claimed that when she had asked for my supervisor's contact information, I had refused to provide it. That last part was technically true in the narrowest sense. I had told her I was the senior authority on the floor for that shift, which was accurate, and I had not given her Philip's direct number because that's not standard protocol. You direct guests to the guest relations line, not to your director's personal extension. But the way she framed it in the complaint made it sound like I was stonewalling her, hiding the chain of command, circling the wagons. When Claudette told me about the second complaint, I felt the first real chill of genuine fear. Not panic, but that cold, clear-headed fear that comes when you realize the ground is shifting under you, and you need to be very careful where you put your feet. I asked Claudette directly, was my job at risk? She said she couldn't speak to outcomes, only process. I appreciated her honesty. I went home that night, and I thought very hard about what I was dealing with. Sandra Croft was not a random dissatisfied guest venting frustration. She was building something. Each complaint was a layer. Each layer added new claims, new angles, new language that made me look worse. And she was doing it through channels that had real consequences, Not the floor complaint box, not a Yelp review, but corporate relations and HR. She knew exactly how this machinery worked. That told me something important about who I was dealing with. I called my union rep that evening. Yes, the Venetian's floor management staff has union representation, which surprises some people, but after 25 years I had paid my dues, and I was going to use every resource available to me. My rep was a woman named Gloria, and when I explained the situation, she told me to document everything, preserve everything, and not speak to anyone from HR or management about the investigation without her present going forward. I told her I'd already done one interview. She said that was fine, but from here on out, no solo conversations. I agreed. The next day I went back to the floor and tried to do my job normally. Marco had been informed that a complaint had been filed related to his table, and he came to find me on my break, visibly shaken. Had been in this industry almost as long as I had, and he knew what false complaints could do. I told him the footage was clear and that I had documented everything. I told him to keep his head down and keep doing his job and to trust the process. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't fully believe the process would protect him. After everything we'd seen over the years, I couldn't entirely blame him. On the fourth day after the original complaint, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. One of our cocktail servers, a young woman named Tiffany Okafor, who had been with us about 2 years, came to find me quietly during a shift change. She pulled me aside near the service corridor and told me she had been in the high-limit room during Sandra's visit. She said she had been within earshot for part of the exchange. And she said she wanted to write a statement, because what Sandra had told corporate did not match what Tiffany had witnessed. I told Tiffany I was grateful, and I told her she should reach out to Claudette in HR directly and offer her statement through the proper channel. I told her not to coordinate with me about the content. She needed to write exactly what she saw and heard, nothing more. I didn't want anyone to be able to claim that I had coached a witness. Tiffany nodded and said she understood. She said she just thought it was wrong, what was happening. I told her I agreed, and I thanked her again. What I found out later, through Claudette's eventual summary of the investigation, was that Tiffany's statement was detailed, consistent, and corroborated by the footage in every particular. She had been no more than 10 feet away during the conversation. She had heard my exact words. She confirmed I had never mentioned footage deletion. She confirmed Marco had been professional throughout. She also noted, and this was something I hadn't expected, that after I walked away from Sandra's table, Sandra had made a phone call. Tiffany hadn't heard the content of the call, but she had seen Sandra glance in the direction of the pit camera before making it, as if she was checking whether she was being watched. That detail lodged itself in my mind. It suggested awareness. It suggested that Sandra knew the cameras were there and had made a calculation about what they could and couldn't capture. Audio, in our high-limit room, is more limited than video. The cameras catch everything visual with remarkable clarity, but the ambient sound is fragmented, especially near the tables where multiple conversations overlap. Sandra may have believed that a phone call made in the room would not be recoverable. She may have been right about that. But the fact that she looked at the camera first told me she was thinking strategically. She wasn't just a frustrated guest. She was running a play. I started asking quiet questions. Not through official channels, I was careful about that, but through the network of relationships you build when you've spent 25 years in one building. I talked to colleagues in guest relations. I talked to a friend who worked the floor at a different property on the Strip. I asked careful, general questions about whether anyone had encountered this name or this type of complaint pattern before. It took about a week, but I eventually heard something that made my blood run cold, and then, slowly, made everything click into place. A colleague at another Las Vegas property, I won't say which one, told me that approximately 8 months earlier, they had handled a complaint from a guest matching Sandra's description. The complaint had followed a similar pattern: initial in-person complaint about dealer conduct, escalation to corporate, follow-up complaint adding new and more serious allegations. That situation had resulted in a dealer being suspended pending investigation. The investigation had ultimately cleared the dealer, but by then the damage was done. The dealer had resigned. The guest, Sandra, though she had used a slightly different name at the other property, had received a significant comp package as part of the resolution. I sat with that information for 2 days before I decided what to do with it. Because I was now looking at something different from a bad faith complaint. I was looking at what appeared to be a pattern of deliberate, coordinated conduct designed to extract value from casino properties by manufacturing grievances and escalating them through official channels until the property decided a settlement was cheaper than the fight. It was sophisticated. It was calculated. And it had apparently worked before. I brought what I had learned to Gloria, my union rep. She listened carefully, asked several sharp questions, and then told me that what I was describing, if accurate, was potentially criminal. Fraud. Extortion, depending on how the demands were framed. She told me I needed to bring this to Claudette and to Philip, formally, with documentation, and that I should request that the investigation be expanded in scope. She also suggested I speak with the property's legal team directly. I requested a meeting with Philip and Claudette together. I walked in with a written summary of everything I had learned, including the name of the colleague who had shared the information about the other property, and I laid it out methodically. I watched Philip's expression shift from his usual low-grade anxiety into something sharper and more focused. Claudette started taking notes before I was halfway through. When I finished, there was a pause, and then Philip said he needed to make some calls. What happened over the following 2 weeks was largely outside my direct visibility. The legal team got involved. I was told, through Gloria, that the property had reached out to the other Las Vegas casino and that their security and legal teams were comparing notes. I was told that corporate had placed a temporary hold on any resolution or response to Sandra's complaints pending the expanded review. I continued working my shifts. I kept my head down. I did my job. Marco was also still on the floor, still working, still professional. I checked in with him briefly every shift, not to discuss the case, but just to make sure he was holding together. He told me once, during a slow Tuesday, that his wife kept asking him if he should start looking for other work, just in case. I told him not to do anything yet. I told him the footage didn't lie, and the truth was going to hold. He gave me a long look and said he hoped I was right. I told him I had 25 years of watching this industry sort itself out, and that while it didn't always move fast, it usually moved in the right direction when the evidence was clear. I believed that. I needed to believe that. About 3 weeks after Sandra's initial complaint, I received a message through Gloria that Claudette wanted to meet with me, and that it would be what she called a resolution meeting. Gloria came with me. We sat down across from Claudette and a woman I hadn't met before, who introduced herself as Renata Voss from the property's legal department. Renata was calm and precise, and had the kind of manner that told you she had done this particular type of meeting many times before. Renata explained that the investigation had concluded. She said that the review of footage, witness statements, incident documentation, and the comparative information regarding the other property had produced a clear picture. She said that the allegations against me, the claims that I had been dismissive, that I had covered for Marco, that I had withheld supervisor contact information improperly, and most critically, that I had told Sandra the footage had been deleted, were not supported by any evidence. She said the footage, the incident report, and Tiffany's witness statement were all consistent and all contradicted Sandra's account directly. She then said that the information about the other property had been independently verified, and that Sandra Croft had been identified as having engaged in a substantially similar complaint pattern at 2 other Las Vegas properties within the past 18 months. She said that the legal team had been in contact with those properties and that a coordinated response was being developed. She said the word I had been waiting to hear: fraud. She said Sandra's conduct appeared to constitute fraudulent misrepresentation made for the purpose of obtaining financial benefit, and that the matter had been referred to the appropriate authorities. I sat very still for a moment. Then I asked about my employment status. Renata said I was fully cleared. She said the record of the complaint would reflect the investigation outcome, and that my personnel file would contain a notation that the allegations had been determined to be without merit. She said management wanted to express their appreciation for the thorough documentation I had maintained throughout the process. Philip, she noted, had specifically commended my incident report as exactly the kind of institutional record-keeping that allowed these situations to be resolved correctly. I thanked her. I thanked Claudette. Gloria squeezed my arm under the table. When I got back to the floor that afternoon, I found Marco at table 4 during his break, sitting in one of the chairs along the wall, staring at nothing in particular. I walked over and sat beside him. I told him it was over. I told him he had been fully cleared and that the guest's complaint had been determined to be fraudulent. I watched the tension leave his face so completely and so suddenly that he looked 10 years younger in the space of about 4 seconds. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." I told him he had nothing to thank me for. He had been honest and professional from start to finish, and the evidence had spoken for itself. He said, "But you didn't give up." I told him 25 years had taught me that the truth needs someone willing to stand behind it. It doesn't always move on its own. Sometimes you have to carry it. As for Sandra Croft, I don't know the full outcome of what the legal referral produced because that was handled by parties above my pay grade, and I was not kept in the loop on the specifics. What I do know is that she was formally flagged in the shared security database that Las Vegas properties maintain cooperatively, which meant she would not be able to walk into any major casino on the Strip and receive the same kind of access she had previously enjoyed. I know that the 2 other properties she had targeted were part of the coordinated response. And I know, from a source I trust in the legal department, that Sandra had in fact received a comp package from one of those other properties as part of their previous resolution, and that recovering that value was part of the legal action being pursued. One lie. That's how it started. One lie about a footage deletion, small enough to sound like a detail, large enough to suggest a cover-up. She had banked on the idea that a property would rather make the noise go away than let it get louder. She had calculated that the expense of a settlement would look smaller than the expense of a fight. What she hadn't calculated for was 25 years of documentation habits, one cocktail server who couldn't stay quiet about what she had witnessed, and a dealer with 18 years of spotless records standing on the other side of the accusation. She also hadn't calculated for a woman who had built her career on exactly this kind of moment, on knowing that the truth was somewhere in the footage, in the timestamps, in the written record, and who wasn't willing to let someone else's lie become her legacy. I went home that night, and I fed my cat. I sat on my balcony in the warm Las Vegas evening, and I listened to the distant sound of the Strip humming below me, that constant, electric, insomniac hum that I've fallen asleep to and woken up to for longer than I can fully account for. I thought about what it means to spend your working life in a building that never closes, that exists outside of normal time, where the lights never dim and the action never fully stops. I thought about how easy it would be in a place like that to assume that nothing is ever really recorded, really preserved, really remembered. That everything dissolves into the ambient noise of the casino floor. But that's not how it works. Not in my room. Not on my watch. Everything is recorded. Everything is timestamped. And in 25 years, I have never once let the record lie. I went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and slept better than I had in 3 weeks.